Today's video is sponsored by Underlucky Stars. Commemorate a special time in your life or the life of a loved one with a personalized star map. More on them in a bit. It was one of the most notorious moments in an already notorious war. In November of 1864, Union General William T. Sherman struck out from the ashes of Atlanta with 62,000 men. His goal was to reach Savannah on the Atlantic coast and take the city from the Confederacy. But Savannah was only the final target. On his 285-mile march through the Georgian countryside, Sherman had an additional plan. One that would live on in infamy. One that could be summed up in a simple phrase. He would make Georgia howl. Over the course of 37 days, Sherman and his men unleashed a wave of destruction unlike anything the Confederacy had ever seen. Railroads were destroyed, farms looted, cotton burned, homes ransacked. While civilian deaths were rare, the population was left traumatized. Yet there was more to Sherman's march to the sea than sheer brutality. An early example of total war, Sherman's march was intended to crush Confederate morale. In doing so, the general hoped to bring the Civil War to an early end and thus save thousands of lives. Whether the cost was worth it is a question that remains controversial to this very day. On November 16, 1864, two Union columns marched out of fire-damaged Atlanta 30 miles apart and headed east. At their head was General William Tecumseh Sherman, fresh off his major victory in the Atlanta Campaign. Before him lay the dusty trails and red clay hills of Georgia, with its forests and plantations, its colonial towns and small farms, its cotton fields and trees laden with hanging moss. But the beauty of the landscape was the last thing on Sherman's mind. He wasn't here to enjoy the mild climate, catch a Falcons game, or chow down on some pecan pie. No, the general was marching for one reason only: to make Georgia squeal, to rip up her railroads, devastate her farms, and leave the population so cowed they'd be unable to wage war. Yet, it'd be a mistake to think that the coming devastation was a spontaneous act, the actions of an impulsive, cold-eyed monster. The seeds for the dark harvest that Georgia was about to reap had been planted months before. As 1864 dawned, the Civil War had been on the cusp of a new phase. The Chattanooga Campaign, the previous November, had effectively seen the Confederates kicked out of Tennessee, leaving the soft underbelly of the Deep South completely exposed. At the same time, there was a huge shake-up underway within the Union's command structure. The whiskey-soaked military genius that was Ulysses S. Grant was in the process of being elevated to supreme command, and with him came a new strategy. The strategy of exhaustion. As Grant saw it, just letting the Union and Confederate armies slug it out had been costly in both men and time. Far better to attack not only the Confederate war machine, but the Confederacy's very ability to make war, to target its infrastructure, its factories, until its fighting potential had been completely exhausted. Yet while the germ of this idea came from Grant, it would be another highly decorated Union soldier who made it a reality: General Sherman. Born in Ohio in 1820, William T. Sherman was a West Point graduate who'd headed the military academy in Louisiana, only abandoning the South when war finally broke out. He was also perhaps Grant's closest friend, a stern-eyed tactician who'd stuck with the younger man through all his alcoholic days, a loyalty Grant had rewarded by helping reinstate Sherman after a mental breakdown. By 1864, the pair were so tight that you could barely slip a sheet of paper between them. So, it should come as no surprise that the earliest incarnation of the strategy of exhaustion manifested under Sherman's watch. The Meridian Campaign is one of those campaigns that only Civil War nuts and people living in Mississippi have really heard of, which is crazy when you realize that it was basically a prelude to what we're discussing today. In February 1864, Sherman marched across the Magnolia State from Vicksburg to Meridian, allowing his men to raid farms while also destroying vital infrastructure. It was a devastating action, one that crippled swaths of central Mississippi. Importantly, though, the damage was mostly economic. Sherman may have had about as much sympathy for the Confederacy as most of us would feel watching Jeffrey Epstein get kicked in the balls, once declaring, "We cannot change the hearts and minds of those people of the South, but we can make war so terrible and make them so sick of war that generations would pass away before they would again appeal to it." But he wasn't some deranged reincarnation of Genghis Khan slaughtering all in his path. Grant wanted to exhaust the South? Fine. Sherman would exhaust it, with extreme prejudice. but that wouldn't mean mass killings of civilians. Not long after Sherman's first destructive march, Grant finalized his grand strategy, a bold plan that envisaged hitting the Confederacy on 5 fronts. General Nathaniel Banks would attack the vital port of Mobile, Alabama, a plan later changed to an invasion of Texas. Meanwhile, the Army of the Potomac would engage General Robert E. Lee's army, while Benjamin Butler marched on Richmond and Franz Sigel disrupted Confederate communications. The last front would be Atlanta, a vital railroad hub for the South, the place from where food and weapons flooded out across the Confederacy. Taking it out would make the exhaustion strategy a reality. And Grant had just the general in mind to bring this grand city to its knees. Of course, the Atlanta campaign wouldn't be quite so simple as Grant yelling, "Yo, Shabs, get down to Georgia and kick a little Dixie butt for me." Between the Union and the city lay an 80,000-man Confederate army under the control of Joseph E. Johnston. While Sherman's combined forces of the Army of the Cumberland, the Army of the Tennessee, and the Army of the Ohio exceeded Johnston's total, it wasn't by a huge margin. So as the Union force left Chattanooga in spring of 1864 and headed south, it wasn't at all clear that Atlanta would fall, that Sherman's men wouldn't fail in their mission. But the Yankees had a couple of advantages on their side. The first was that Sherman was simply in another league to Johnson. Although he was respected, Johnson wasn't a Stonewall Jackson, a miracle worker who could turn the tide of battle. Instead, Johnson was a guy who liked to play it safe, so safe that you'd have to wonder if he'd ever experienced any emotion other than wary caution. His whole shtick was to retreat, dig into trenches, and let the enemy get cut down when they charged head-on. A potentially deadly strategy, but only if your opponent was dumb enough to go for the full frontal assault. And, as we'll soon see, Sherman was rarely that dumb. The other plus for the Union was that Sherman had the confidence of his superiors and was surrounded by competent commanders like George Thomas and James B. McPherson. Johnson, by contrast, had a famously stormy relationship with Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who seems to have found his general only fractionally less irritating than hemorrhoids. He was also surrounded not by commanders who had his back, but by guys like John B. Hood, who openly wanted his job. So, as Sherman's army crossed into Georgia that May, they did so with a small but real edge over their opponents. And in the fight for Atlanta, that small edge would be all they needed. The moment the campaign kicked off, it set the pattern of combat for the summer, with Johnson trying to dig in while Sherman tried to flank him and force a retreat. And retreat the Confederates did. By May 25th, Johnson's men had pulled all the way back to New Hope Church, just 35 miles north of Atlanta. But even though Johnson managed to halt the Union advance both here and at Pickett's Mill in blistering actions that saw the Confederates make mincemeat of the Yankees, it was just a reprieve. By early June, Sherman had again flanked Johnson. Once again, the Southern forces left their trenches and drew backwards towards the city. Yet while Sherman's advance was inexorable, it also wasn't a cakewalk. Remember when we said Sherman was rarely dumb enough to try a frontal assault? Well, there's a difference between rarely and never. On June the 27th, Sherman nearly lost everything by pulling this exact maneuver at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, a bloodbath which saw 3 times as many northern casualties as southern ones. But this horrific misstep wouldn't prove fatal. Even as his men fell, Sherman once again managed to flank Johnson. Once again, the Confederates were forced to pull back. And so the slow grind toward Atlanta continued. July 1864 dawned on a city sweltering in the heat and suffocating under a blanket of fear. Prior to the Civil War, Atlanta had been home to some 20,000 people. Now a mere 4,000 remained, a mix of white women and children and enslaved black people. As Johnson dug his final trenches just beyond the city's limits, those left began to panic. Nor were they the only ones. As evacuation orders were issued, panic was also starting to grip Confederate high command. On July the 18th, Jefferson Davis finally removed the annoying hemorrhoid that was Johnson, replacing him with Johnson's old frenemy, John Hood. A guy who'd already sacrificed one leg and one arm for the Confederate cause, Hood's gamble was that he'd come out swinging, take the Yankees by surprise, and hit them so hard they'd be knocked clear back across the Mason-Dixon line. While the first 2 parts of this plan would succeed, the crucial third part would be where it failed. After a summer of fighting, the Confederates were simply too weak to rout the Yankees. Like it or not, William Sherman was coming for Atlanta. By the time he was done, there'd be very little left. Alright, we'll get back to today's video in just a second, but first, quick word from a brand new sponsor, Under Lucky Stars. Under Lucky Stars make these. Look at this. There's my big light, but this is a personalized... Can you guys hear me okay? Let's get that mic over there. This is a personalized star map that shows the unique alignment of stars as chosen by you. I chose this as a Valentine's Day gift for my wife, and this is what the stars looked like when and where my wife and I got married. Isn't that nice? It's also verified by astrophysicists from NASA, so you know you're getting the real deal. I'm going to put that down because it's absolutely enormous. All you have to do is enter the location, date, and time of a special moment in your life that you'd like to commemorate, and under Lucky Stars, they give you this, showing you exactly what the stars look like. It's on thick, museum-quality matte art paper, and there are 15 designs and border styles to choose from. Valentine's Day is right around the corner, and this is a home-run gift idea, especially if you're a bit of a last-minute lad who's still working on what to get your partner. Right now, you guys can take advantage of a special 10% discount this Valentine's Day. Just go to underluckystars.com/warographics and use the code warographics to get your loved one a gift they will never forget. I'm looking forward to giving that to my wife. I hope she doesn't watch these videos. We're good. She won't find out. She won't know. And now back to today's video. In the end, Hood's glorious strike back amounted to a mere 3 serious battles. 3 battles, none of which went the way that he wanted them to. There was the Battle of Peachtree Creek against George Thomas's forces, which ended in a draw, but didn't solve the problem of the massive goddamn Union army that was approaching Atlanta. There was the Battle of Atlanta itself, which saw Union General James B. McPherson killed, but only at the cost of thousands of Confederate soldiers. Not that Hood felt like celebrating anyway. He and McPherson had been classmates in their West Point days, and the general's death hurt Hood almost as much as it hurt Sherman. Finally, there was the staggeringly one-sided Battle of Ezra Church. On July the 28th, McPherson's replacement, Oliver O. Howard, led his army to try and cut off one of Atlanta's main railroads. Hood threw everything in a suicidal attack to try and stop them, and suicidal is absolutely the right word. Against 642 casualties on the Union side, Hood lost over 3,000 men. In the mere 20 days he'd been in charge, John Bell Hood had overseen a depletion of his ranks usually associated with an outbreak of smallpox. Wounded, broken, he switched tactics, turning instead to a defense of the city. But really, the campaign was over. All that was left to do was take bets on when Atlanta would fall. In the end, the siege lasted till September. In that time, Sherman set up artillery to pound the city. Starting on July the 20th, shells began falling onto the hot, dusty streets, piercing the humid air with a whizzing sound before crashing to earth. One estimate we saw claims 30,000 shells hit Atlanta over the next month. On August the 9th alone, 7 people were killed, including 2 children and a freed black barber. Yet, despite the casualties, this wasn't some merciless revenge bombing, an attempt to level a symbol of Southern pride and all within her. Even as the shells fell, the Federals were trying to take out the railroads to cut all the supply lines. Finally, on August the 31st, they succeeded. That day, during the Battle of Jonesborough, the last of the 4 tracks linking Atlanta to the wider world was taken by Sherman. When he received word, Hood knew the game was up. On September the 1st, the remnants of the Confederate army fled. Everything of military value not destroyed in the shelling was set on fire or blown up. As they retreated, looting swept the city, a last giddy convulsion in a place whose time had come. The next day, Mayor James Calhoun formally surrendered Atlanta. He did so, hoping the Union would protect people's property. But there was no such luck. After 6 days of occupation, Sherman issued Order 67, forcing the 3,000 remaining civilians to evacuate. By September the 18th, Atlanta was devoid of people not connected to the Union Army. Back in the north, the fall of Atlanta was the news everyone had been waiting for. After a miserable summer in which most of Grant's 5 points of attack had been thwarted, the fight had seemed to be draining out of the Union, and with it, Abraham Lincoln's chances of re-election. Now with Sherman's resounding victory, things were looking up. A wave of confidence swept through the North. When the 8th of November rolled around, a newly energized Lincoln would crush his opponent at the ballot box. Shortly after, Sherman would depart for the sea. It's worth noting here that this wasn't the original plan. John Hood was taking the remnants of his army up to Tennessee, goading Sherman to follow him. Both Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant wanted the general to do just that. But Uncle Billy had other ideas. There, ahead of time, lay the heart of Dixie, the largest Confederate state, rich with crops and cotton, a place of agriculture and plantations, both the breadbasket of the South and its economic colossus. If the strategy of exhaustion called for curtailing the enemy's physical ability to make war, then Sherman didn't just want to stop with Atlanta. As he wrote to Grant, "Until we can repopulate Georgia, it is useless to occupy it. But the utter destruction of its roads, houses, and people will cripple their military resources. I can make the march and make Georgia howl." When Lincoln heard of Sherman's plan, his original response was something along the lines of, "What the f***, dude? No." What eventually swung him round was Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was wary about the proposed march too, but he respected Sherman. When the older man leaned on him, he agreed to talk the president around. He told Lincoln that this wasn't the same as letting Hood rampage in Tennessee unchecked, that Sherman had already dispatched George Thomas to stop the Confederate force. It was a tough sell, but in the end, Lincoln bowed to Grant's experience. Grant formally gave his old friend the go-ahead. On November the 10th, Uncle Billy ordered new fires to be set in Atlanta to destroy anything of military value. By November the 11th, Union troops were putting even non-valuable buildings to the torch. Combined with the effects of the shelling and the fires previously started by Hood's men, some 40% of Atlanta would be burned. One Union soldier later recalled, "For miles around the country was as light as day, the flames shooting up for hundreds of feet into the air." But Sherman wasn't fazed. He knew this was just the beginning. On November the 16th, 62,000 Union soldiers at last turned their backs on the charred city. As smoke snaked into the late autumn sky, they pointed in the direction of the Atlantic, some 285 miles east. And so began the march to the sea. Rather than a single formation, Sherman broke his men into two wings under Oliver O. Howard and Henry W. Slocum, marching 30 miles apart. Providing cover was a small cavalry force, but they were hardly needed. With Hood's army tied up in Tennessee, almost no Confederate forces remained to defend Georgia. In terms of serious fighters, Joseph Wheeler's 3,500 cavalry force was all that was left, enough to harass Sherman's men, but nowhere near enough to stop him or significantly slow them. Beyond that, there were only militias, often formed of teenage boys and old men. When they did attack, it was often like watching the Mighty Ducks take on the Red Army. The Battle of Griswoldville on November the 22nd saw the Georgia militia suffer 10 times the casualties of the Federals. With figures like that, it was clear no one could oppose Sherman, no matter what he did. And with that phrase, we get to the heart of why Sherman's march remains so controversial. For some today, the trail of destruction Sherman cut across Georgia remains an unparalleled act of brutality. Yet if a simple war crime was all it was, there'd be no controversy. Had the Federals slaughtered locals as they moved east, everyone would remember it as an act of villainy. Instead, the shades of grey come from the way that Sherman conducted his campaign. The balancing act he tried to achieve between keeping his forces on a tight leash and doing enough damage to help end the war. You could see this tension in the special field orders that he issued. On the one hand, you have orders that forbade not only the destruction of private property, but the use of abusive language when appropriating supplies. You have two orders forbidding Sherman's men from trespassing or harming locals, and wherever possible, only stealing horses from those rich enough to replace them. On the other hand, though, are the orders placing the ability to destroy mills and houses in the hands of individual commanders, or to unleash, quote, a devastation more or less relentless wherever resistance was encountered. Finally, there's the basic necessity of the army's survival. The moment he struck out from Atlanta, Sherman severed his supply lines. He intended to let his men live off the land, foraging what they needed from the farms. As he put it, "Where 1,000,000 people live, my army won't starve." The problem is that those 1,000,000 people kind of wanted that food for themselves, the food they'd grown to feed their families, that they needed to survive. But what they wanted no longer mattered. Sherman was determined to make old and young, rich and poor feel the hard hand of war, to make them really understand the pain of succession. Ultimately, that pain would be so sharp that it'd mark Sherman's reputation for all eternity. So we've established the March to the Sea wasn't like some plague of locusts devouring all in its path. But that raises a question. What was it like? If you were a farmer in Sherman's path, what would have been your experience? The first thing to note is that it's unlikely you'd have encountered the main columns. The real issue for Georgia's citizens were the foragers, colloquially known as bummers. A hard nickname for a Brit to say with a straight face, but I did my best. Special Field Order 120 had created designated parties with instructions to forage liberally. As the main column set up camp, these parties would fan out across the countryside, targeting farms. In some cases, targeting meant requisitioning cops, slaughtering animals, even making off with valuables. But it could also mean more. While Sherman may have set limits on his men's behavior, he'd also have given them a lot of wiggle room. And after 3 years of fighting, many Union soldiers used that room to get revenge. Bummers became notorious for ransacking homes, sometimes putting anything they couldn't carry to the torch. Such acts of arson were usually random, but this only added to the fear. Imagine being a subsistence farmer aware the Federals are approaching, aware too that they might destroy your entire livelihood or leave you mostly untouched, and there's nothing you could do to affect that decision. It'd drive you insane. Nor was it only the country dwellers who suffered this anxiety. After a deliberate feint toward the cities of Augusta and Macon, Sherman's 2 columns reached the then capital of Milledgeville around Thanksgiving. There, they attacked buildings and destroyed records before finally entering the state capital and holding a mock vote, rescinding Georgia's ordinance of secession. For residents, the carnival atmosphere was highly unnerving, like watching the Joker play some prank that could turn deadly at any moment. Not that it did. Sherman's men left Milledgeville on November the 24th, leaving a population that was shaken but broadly unharmed. Not that there weren't moments of brutality, though. After some Union POWs were found who'd escaped a Confederate camp, some of the foragers were so outraged at their condition that they began revenge attacks on locals. For days, the red glow from barns set alight could be sighted across the countryside. Yet it's worth noting that not all those fires were set by the Yankees. Unable to halt the Union's advance, some of Wheeler's cavalry resorted to scorched earth tactics, starting their own infernos, burning supplies. In the popular imagination, these attacks were often attributed to Sherman, something Uncle Billy did nothing to discourage. A key part of Sherman's strategy was to make the populace mentally suffer, crushed by fear. In this sense, Wheeler's burnings were basically free publicity. In addition to cowing the populace, Sherman was determined to do serious economic damage. Every time his men came across rail tracks, they'd destroy them, heating the metal up with fires and then twisting the rail into unusable shapes, nicknamed Sherman's neckties. Bridges were collapsed, trees felled across roads, telegraph lines torn down. The overall effect was not unlike a Category 5 hurricane sweeping through, the only difference being that this hurricane actively enjoyed messing up the economy. In the context of the Deep South at the time, this also meant freeing slaves. Today, the treatment of formerly enslaved people on the march is controversial, because while Sherman's men did free them, they were frequently racist themselves, treating the freed people with disrespect and even threats of violence. But even the most disrespectful common soldier had nothing on Jefferson C. Davis. A Union general, unlike his near-identically named Southern counterpart, Davis was in charge of getting the Army's rearguard over a pontoon bridge across Ebeneezer Creek on December the 9th. There had been heavy rains and the river was swollen. When 650 fugitive slaves following the march tried to cross, Davis ordered them to wait until his men were over. When the last Union soldier was across, Davis had the pontoon bridge unlashed, trapping the freed slaves on the other side. Desperate not to be recaptured, knowing Wheeler's men were near, many tried to swim for safety. While some made it, hundreds are thought to have drowned. It was the greatest single loss of life on the entire march, and also the most shameful, especially when Sherman later defended Davis's actions. But by now, the march was almost over. On December the 12th, Union forces sighted Savannah, the city they'd spent the best part of a month reaching. Now all they had to do was take it. Ultimately, Savannah's fate was decided in just 15 minutes. Determined to avoid a siege, Sherman instead threw his men at Fort McCallister on December the 13th, the key link in the city's southern defenses. It was a suicidal charge, one that saw the Union's casualty rate triple that of the fort's defenders. But Sherman had the numbers on his side. In just a quarter of an hour, Fort McCallister had fallen, and just like that, defending Savannah became impossible. The Confederate garrison inside put up a good show, refusing to surrender when Sherman demanded it. But they knew as well as anyone that the game was up. On the night of December the 20th, they quietly evacuated the city, fleeing across the river into South Carolina. The next day, the city surrendered. On December the 22nd, Sherman telegrams Lincoln, presenting him Savannah as a Christmas gift. With that action, the March to the Sea came to a victorious end. Over the last 37 days, Sherman's men had covered 285 miles. In that time, they'd destroyed 300 miles of railroad, confiscated 5,000 horses, 400 mules, and 13,000 cattle, and requisitioned 10 million pounds of corn. Nearly every cotton gin and mill they encountered, the backbone of the economy, had been smashed. Homes had been damaged, barns set alight, entire farms laid to waste. From being the South's breadbasket, Georgia became a place that could barely feed itself. By his own estimate, Sherman placed the cost of all this destruction at $100 million. That's not in today's dollars. That's $100 million in old-timey money. Today it'd be more like $1.7 billion. Sherman had wanted to make the state howl. Well, this was that cry made flesh. Yet while the economic costs were high, the human cost was relatively small. During the whole 6 weeks of the March to the Sea, under 3,000 casualties were reported, few of whom were civilians. Compared to other infamous actions in the Civil War, Sherman's March to the Sea was a mere drop in an ocean of blood. Then there was the fact of all the newly freed slaves. Despite the shameful episode at Ebeneezer Creek, Sherman's men had freed a staggering number of slaves en route to Savannah, anywhere between 17 and 25,000. Famously, this led, on January 16, 1865, to Special Field Orders 15, which confiscated 400,000 acres of land and divided it into 40-acre plots, with each plot going to one black family. Although President Andrew Johnson would quickly rescind this order, it remains a landmark moment in US history. So, at the end of it all then, how are we to judge Sherman's infamous expedition? Well, on its own terms, there's no doubt it succeeded. Sherman wanted to bring total war to the South, to demoralize its citizens, cripple its economy, and end its ability to make war. At all three of those goals, he succeeded. To this day, the humiliation of the March to the Sea remains a potent Southern memory. Meanwhile, there are economists who have documented lasting negative effects on Georgian agriculture as late as 1920. The war, too, ended soon after, following a far more brutal march Sherman took through the Carolinas, potentially something we'll cover in a future episode. But while the March to the Sea was certainly a success, was it justifiable? Was it, in short, a military necessity? Or was it a crime? All we can say is that this is a question people have been wrestling with for nearly 160 years, and it's unlikely to go away anytime soon. To Sherman's defenders, the narrative that this campaign was an exercise in brutality will always be overblown. To his attackers, it will forever remain a stark example of how civilians were forced to needlessly suffer at a celebrated general's hands. One thing, however, is certain. Whether you think this was a tale of villainy or strategy, it's clear that Sherman's March to the Sea continues to resonate across American history in all sorts of profound ways. Whichever side of the debate we fall on, we should all at least agree that its lessons should never be forgotten. So I really hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for watching.